I don't remember the first time I met Mr. Hanley, but I remember the second one very clearly, which feels wrong. You'd think the first one would matter more. Sometimes I try to remember it anyway, just to see if it comes back. It doesn't. The second time was after lunch. I'd been crying in the bathroom, not loudly, just the kind where you're trying not to make your face do anything permanent. The hall monitor knocked and asked if I was okay, and I said yes, too fast, and that's how I ended up there. I remember thinking afterward that if I'd waited even a second longer, maybe I wouldn't have gone. Mr. Hanley's office smelled like those little orange wipes teachers use on desks. He had a bowl of peppermints on the table between the chairs. He didn't offer one. He waited until I asked. I don't know why that stuck with me, but it did. He asked me why I was upset, and I said I wasn't upset, which made him nod in a way that felt like he'd written something down even though he hadn't yet. He wrote later, after I talked more. I watched the pen move. I tried not to. I kept thinking that if I watched closely enough, I'd catch the moment where it stopped being what I said. We got off on the wrong foot because I didn't like how quiet he was. Not listening quiet, but recording quiet. It made me feel like I was already behind. But over time it got easier, or at least smoother. I learned which questions meant I could give short answers and which ones meant I needed to explain something all the way or he'd circle back to it next time. He learned that I didn't like being asked about my parents separately. I also learned that correcting him slowed things down in a bad way. He called our meetings check-ins. That helped. Made it sound like I wasn't there because something was wrong, just because something needed maintenance, like an oil change. Sometimes he'd say, "So last time you mentioned feeling overwhelmed in group settings." And I would think, that's not what I said. But it was close enough that correcting him felt rude or nitpicky, or like I was missing the point. Sometimes I couldn't remember what I had said clearly enough to be sure. I didn't know then how often I let that go. I didn't think of it as letting anything go, really. There was a period where I thought he was on my side. That might be an exaggeration. Maybe I thought he wasn't against me. There's a difference. I just didn't know it yet. When I got my first detention that year for skipping the last 10 minutes of math, I went to him before anyone told me to. I wanted him to hear it from me. I wanted it to stay small. He said, "So you disengaged from class because you were emotionally flooded." I remember laughing a little because that wasn't true, and also because it sounded like something from a pamphlet. The laugh came out sharper than I meant it to. "I just didn't want to be there," I said. I remember choosing the words carefully. He smiled, not big, just enough to show that he wasn't offended. "Sometimes that's how it shows up," he said. Again, I didn't correct him, which feels important now. At that time, it just felt tiring. By winter, teachers were emailing him about me instead of my parents. That was supposed to be good. It meant things weren't escalating. It also meant that I stopped hearing things directly. I got used to being called down during second period. I got used to the secretary not looking at me when she handed me the pass. I started to feel strange when the days went by without it. Mr. Hanley would always start with, "So, how are things going?" Like it was a real question. Sometimes my stomach hurt when he said it. I learned to say, "Okay," in a way that made him nod. I learned to say it even when it wasn't true. I learned to say, "I'm working on it." I learned that this phrase ended things faster. I learned not to say certain words because they made his pen move faster. I don't remember ever deciding that. I just noticed it one day. I didn't notice the language changing at first. I don't think anyone would. That's probably why it worked. It's not like he put words in my mouth. He just streamlined them. That's the word he would use, I think. If I said I was angry, he'd say I was frustrated. If I said someone was being mean, he'd say there was a social misunderstanding. If I said I didn't trust someone, he'd say that I was feeling unsafe. Those all sound similar. They aren't, but you can see how I'd let them pass. They also sound calmer, safer, less like something that needs fixing. The problem was that after a while, when he repeated things back to me, I'd honestly forget which version I'd said first. Sometimes I'd open my mouth to correct him and nothing came out. The incident happened in March. People keep calling it that. The incident. Even now. I don't remember when I started calling it that too. There was a substitute in science. Someone knocked over a stool. Someone laughed. I said something. I don't remember exactly what. And the room went quiet in a way that felt heavy, like when a fire alarm almost goes off but doesn't. I remember thinking, that's not what I meant, before anyone said anything. The substitute told me to step into the hall. I didn't, not right away. That was probably the mistake. I remember my heart beating very fast, like it wanted to get somewhere before I did. I don't remember raising my voice, but I don't remember not raising it either. That gap bothers me more than it should. I remember thinking that if I just explained, it would be fine. I remember realizing mid-sentence that explaining wasn't doing anything, and it wasn't fine. By the end of the day, I was told there would be a meeting with the assistant principal and Mr. Hanley. When they said his name, I felt a brief, stupid relief. Then something cold underneath it. That night, I kept rehearsing what I would say. I didn't write it down because I didn't want to see it in my own handwriting. I just said it in my head over and over, trying different versions until one sounded calm enough. Every version sounded wrong once I imagined it out loud. The next morning, when I walked into the conference room, Mr. Hanley smiled at me like we were on time for something together, like we were on the same side of the table. He had a folder. That wasn't new. What was new was how thick it was. I remember feeling a pressure behind my eyes when I saw it. They started with him. He said, to give some context, and then he started reading. I remember thinking I hadn't agreed to that order. Not reading exactly, summarizing, but I could see the pages as he turned them. I tried to match what he was saying to specific moments in my head, and I couldn't. He talked about patterns. He talked about escalation. He talked about how I struggle with emotional regulation in structured environments. That phrase landed wrong. I remember thinking it sounded medical. I remember thinking it sounded permanent. He said, as we've discussed before, and I knew he was talking to me, but he was looking at the assistant principal. I felt myself shrink a little in the chair. Then he said something I didn't recognize at all. He said I had expressed ongoing feelings of hostility toward authority figures. My ears rang when he said that. I waited for him to stop so I could say that that wasn't true. I waited too long. He didn't stop. He said I had acknowledged difficulty distinguishing perceived threat from actual intent. I felt my face get hot. Not angry hot, embarrassed hot, trapped hot. I tried to interrupt. He held up a finger, not at me, just in the air, and said, I'll get there. I remember feeling something sharp in my chest at that. I remember thinking, get where? When he finally looked at me and said, does that sound accurate to you? It was in the same tone he used when asking if I wanted a peppermint. Everyone was looking at me. I couldn't tell what they expected my face to do. I said yes. I don't know why. I think I was afraid that if I said no, I'd have to explain everything all at once, and I didn't know why or how. I think I was still trying to figure out when all of this had happened. He went on. He said, "So when this incident occurred, it wasn't entirely unexpected." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. That was when something shifted. Not snapped, it slid. Like when you realize the floor isn't level after you've already been standing there. Because if it wasn't expected, then it was already written somewhere. And if it was already written somewhere, then it had been true longer than I remembered. Longer than I could argue with. The assistant principal nodded. She wrote something down. The sound of that pen felt loud. We talked about consequences. They talked about support plans. They talked about how this wasn't punitive. My hands were shaking under the table. I pressed them together so that no one would see. I kept waiting for the part where I explained what I meant to say in science class. I kept waiting for someone to ask. It never came. After the meeting, Mr. Hanley walked me back to class. He said, "You handled that really maturely." My throat hurt. I nodded anyway. I didn't answer. He said, "This will help us help you." I remember thinking that I didn't know what this was anymore. That night, my mom asked me what had happened. I started explaining and heard myself say, "I have trouble regulating my emotions." I stopped talking after that because the words didn't feel like mine once they were out. I went back to Mr. Hanley's office the next week. Same chairs, same smell. I noticed my foot wouldn't stop bouncing. He asked how I was feeling about the meeting. I said, confused. What I meant was scared, but that felt like the wrong word. He nodded and said, "That makes sense." Then he added gently, "Given your patterns." I felt something drop in my stomach when he said that. That was the first time I felt afraid of him. Not suddenly, not sharply, just enough that it didn't go away. Not because he'd done anything loud or sudden, but because I couldn't tell anymore which parts of me he'd learned and which parts he'd taught, and because he seemed very sure of the difference. He slid a paper across the desk. "This is just for you to look over," he said. It was a summary. Not the whole folder, just the highlights. The paper shook in my hands. I read sentences that sounded like me if someone else had finished them, if someone else had decided where they were going. I didn't correct anything. I didn't know how. I couldn't tell where I was supposed to start. At the bottom, there was a line that said, "Student demonstrates increased insight into her behaviors." I stared at it longer than I meant to. I signed it because he handed me a pen. My name looked strange when I wrote it. Later, when I tried to remember what I'd actually said in science class, I couldn't get past the language he'd used to describe it. Every version I came up with sounded wrong. I still don't know what I meant to say. Sometimes I think that's the worst part. Not that he changed my words. That when it mattered, they were already gone. There are times when holding on to yourself takes more effort than anyone notices. When your instincts start to blur, that doesn't mean they're wrong. Listen to them and protect yourself. Please take care of yourself and those around you, and thank you for being here.